So maybe let's start. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, who is joining from China. My name is Alessio Petino. I'm the knowledge coordinator at the USME Centre in Beijing. It's a great pleasure to be here today to welcome you to this webinar, which is about software, how to sell software in China. I have to say that we have done something before in ICT, blockchain. We did something, but not really on software. So it's great that we could do this webinar today on this topic. So actually, the reason why we decided to do a webinar on this topic is related to some requests that we received from some European software companies on this how to sell the products to China, and that's why we decided to do this. Actually, some software can be a bit tricky as a product. Certainly it's not a physical good, so it's not something that goes to customs. Sometimes could be considered maybe as a service, so it's a bit tricky. And then in addition, last year China issued two major laws about the personal information protection as well as data security, which make the increase the requirements for selling, for operating software. And we are going to explore to discuss about these aspects in today's webinar. Before doing that, however, I would like to spend a few minutes on introducing the USME Centre for those of you who don't know us. The USME Centre is a project funded by the European Union since 2010. Its objective is to help European small and medium enterprises to export to China, to get ready to know China, and to do business in or with China. We are in a third phase of the project, which is run by a consortium of 5 chambers of commerce and business on the bottom. And there will be, and there is going, actually also have a good news. We have recently received a project extension, and we will be running until June this year. And after then, there will be a new phase of the project, which will run for 3 more years. So we are going to be around for a while, and we hope to continue to be a good reference point for European SMEs looking into China. We partner up with a lot of organizations, business, government, and we have a physical office in Beijing, which is where I am now. Very briefly, we have 4 main types of services. The first one is what we call the Knowledge Center. Basically, we write reports, guidelines, case studies on different aspects of doing business to China. If you go to our website here, you can see the screenshot. This is a screenshot of some of the reports we have, but we have around 200 of such reports. So you can take a look. Second service we have, it's what we call Advice Center. Basically is a sort of help desk that companies can use to seek some professional advice on different aspects, also technical ones. For instance, what kind of standards do I have to comply with, customs, my product is stuck at the customs, or what kind of regulations was published, and so on. You can also book one-to-one calls with us completely free of charge. Yeah, we also have other tools, FAQs. We have a self-diagnosis tool, which is basically some quizzes that you can do to basically assess your knowledge of China. Of course, this is more for newcomers, but it provides you a tailored list of additional readings and FAQs or related content we have that can help you assess what answers you choose in a correct way or in a wrong way. A third service we have is a training center, which is basically sort of what we're doing today. We organize webinars and workshops on different topics, like we're doing today on software. And by the way, we all our training, all our webinars are recorded and uploaded on our YouTube, on the USME Center's YouTube channel, and you can rewatch them in the future. This is an example of our YouTube. Everything we have done, it's there. So ready to be rewatched. Third service, the last service we have is the advocacy platform, which basically we have a working group together with the European Chamber, through which we try to disseminate information about upcoming regulations, drafts for comments, and so on. Very briefly, we are doing a lot of activities. This is an overview of the 3 next upcoming activities, but there are going to be other ones. For instance, one which I think is very useful and still related somehow to today is about commercial dispute resolutions on the 29th of April. So how to deal with these resolutions. But then there will be other ones to follow. So without further ado, I will now move into the topic of this webinar, and it's a great pleasure to have with us today Mr. Rich Bishop, who is the co-founder and CEO of App in China. App in China is actually they're specialists in this field. They are leading publisher and operator of international software in China. They've been operating for almost a decade. And now an App in China has published over 300 of the world's most popular software in the Chinese market. But maybe, Rich, you can tell us a bit more about yourself, about your company, and I will give the floor to you now.
Great, thank you, Alessio, and welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be here speaking in front of you. I'd like to begin by just clarifying who this talk is suitable for. So it's suitable for any European companies that are already operating in China and have software, including apps, websites, or SaaS platforms, and want to make sure that this software is fully compliant with Chinese law. It's also suitable for any European companies that have not yet entered the Chinese market, but have some form of software product that they are interested in selling to Chinese companies or Chinese individuals. So just briefly about our company and what we do. As Alessio mentioned, we're the leading publisher and operator of international software in the Chinese market. We currently publish software from over 300 of the world's largest companies, and we have close partnerships with large companies like Alibaba, Apple, AWS, Tencent, Microsoft, and ByteDance. Our company holds all of the key licenses that are required to publish and operate software in the Chinese market. I'll come to the reason why those licenses are required in a second. And then beyond just publishing the software and making it available in China, we also have an experienced operations team that will ensure that we achieve the best possible results for each of our clients' software in the Chinese market. So I'm going to cover compliance, localization, and sales channels. So compliance obviously is important globally, of course, but is especially important in China due to a range of software and tech and data related laws and regulations, many of which have just been released in the last year or so. Some of the key laws that are relevant here are the cybersecurity law, the data security law, and the personal information protection law, which is kind of China's equivalent of the GDPR in the EU. So the first step to ensure compliance for your software in China is to conduct a compliance report. This is based on the functionality of your software and the types of data that are collected. And this will confirm all of the licenses, certificates, and filings that are needed to legally publish and operate your software in China. This can be provided by a company like App in China, or you can work with a law firm to provide this. The types of licenses, certificates, and filings that are needed can generally be divided into two categories. So one is entity compliance. So these are any licenses that must be held by the entity, the legal entity that is publishing the software in China. This is fairly unique to China. In most countries, you don't need special licenses to publish and operate software, but in China, it's very much required. And then secondly, you have software compliance. So these are any certificates and filings that must be obtained for the specific software which your company develops and publishes. So we'll start off with entity compliance. So again, this is the licenses that must be held by the company, the legal entity which publishes and operates the software. The big issue in China is that many of the most commonly required licenses cannot be held by a majority foreign invested entity. So some of the key, most commonly required licenses, definitely by far the most commonly required is the B25 commercial ICP license. And then there's the B21 EDI license, which is for kind of platforms with, providing a platform for two parties to buy and sell services and products. And the B11 license, which is for providing an internet data center. So whether or not you require one or more of these licenses in order to publish and operate your software in China, as I said, depends on the functionality of the software, and you would need a compliance report in order to confirm that. If you need one or more of these restricted licenses, then you will not be able to obtain this license yourself under your Chinese entity, your subsidiary, unless that subsidiary is majority Chinese owned. You have a kind of joint venture of that sort. If that is the case, then you will need to work with a local publisher to publish and operate your software. This may include App in China, our company, or for larger companies, they may form a partnership with a company like Tencent or Alibaba. This publisher will then publish and operate your software in China, licensing the software from your company and paying a licensing fee to your company as a result. If your software doesn't require any of these restricted licenses, then you will be able to open a Chinese entity yourself if you don't have one already, apply for and obtain these licenses under your Chinese subsidiary. That's obviously, in most cases, the best choice for your company in order to maintain full control and ownership under your own entity. So come next to the software compliance. As I said, this has to be applied for every software that you are publishing in the Chinese market. By far, the most common of these are the Software Copyright Certificate, the SCC. This is a certificate to copyright your software, specifically the code, in order to protect it in the Chinese market. And then second is the ICP filing. So this is a filing with the Chinese government, confirming that the content that you are providing in China, which may be through a website or an app or a SaaS platform, is compliant with Chinese law. And then the third category, which is not required in all cases, is the MLPS, the Multi-Level Protection Scheme filing. And this is a filing confirming that any data that you are collecting from Chinese users is stored in a safe and secure way. And then finally, the third category of compliance is operational compliance. So once you have all those licenses, certificates, and filings, you also obviously have to ensure that your software is run in China without breaking any laws and regulations. As I mentioned, so cybersecurity law, data security law, and the PIPL, Personal Information Protection Law, are some of the key laws and regulations, but there's a very long list, and many laws and regulations also specific to certain industries. For example, education industry, medical industry, etc. The Personal Information Protection Law is all about personal information, as you would imagine. It's basically the equivalent of the EU's GDPR law. It's different, but it's an equivalent for China. Some of the key requirements of it, just to summarize it briefly, if you are collecting what is defined as personal information, so things like email addresses or names, you have to obtain consent from users before this information is exported outside of China. And in this case, export means just being viewed from outside of China. It doesn't have to be an actual transfer of data. If you have what is defined as sensitive personal information, so one example of that is ID card numbers or biometric information, then you have to obtain special permission from the applicable government department before you can export this data out of China. And then finally, there is also a restricted category called critical information infrastructure organizations. So if you are collecting data from companies that are defined as critical information infrastructure, then you will also need to apply for special permission from the government bureau that is responsible for that particular industry. Some examples of that are things like sort of electricity, power generation, water supplies, this type of thing. So that's a summary of the compliance requirements. Moving on now to localization. So this is a pretty broad topic. You may be required to localize your software in order to ensure compliance with Chinese law, and/or you may also need to do it in order to improve the user experience, which may be the UI and UX, or it may be just the speed at which the software loads in the Chinese market. For localization, usually the first step is to conduct a competitor analysis. So obviously assessing, identifying and assessing your closest competitors in the Chinese market, understanding exactly what they offer in terms of functionality and pricing. And then once you've gathered this data, then deciding whether you need to make adjustments to ensure that you're competitive with Chinese companies. The second step is user testing. So we generally recommend that you conduct testing either in person or by video in order to get feedback from real users and identify any changes that need to be made to ensure that your software matches their requirements. Next is integrations. So there are many integrations which are blocked in China or simply not relevant to the Chinese market. What App in China does is we do an assessment of your software, give you a list of all of the integrations that need to be swapped with local equivalents. Common examples are WeChat Pay and Alipay. So obviously, international payment solutions like PayPal, generally not used in China. WeChat Pay and Alipay are by far the dominant payment solutions. WeChat login, if you have login with Google or this type of thing, you'll need to replace with WeChat login or perhaps phone SMS login instead. And ad monetization. So if you have an app, for example, typically companies use AdMob from Google. AdMob doesn't really work in China, so you need to replace it with a local alternative in order to maximize your ad revenue. Next up is cloud services. So depending on the type of data that you collect, you may be required to host your software in the Chinese market. If so, then you can work with any of the major providers in China, AWS, Alibaba Cloud, Azure, and Tencent Cloud. Generally, our clients will work with whichever provider they use internationally. So if their developers are familiar with AWS, for example, then their preference is usually to work with AWS in China. For distribution, this is if you have an Android app specifically. Obviously, Google Play is blocked in China. It's not available. And so you will need to instead distribute your app on the major Chinese Android app stores. The largest of these are Huawei, Oppo, Tencent, Vivo, and Xiaomi. This one good kind of advantage of the Chinese Android app stores is that for non-gaming apps, they don't take any revenue share. So Google Play would typically take 30%. Apple App Store is the same, but for Chinese Android stores, it's 0% on non-gaming apps. For games, they take typically up to 50%. And then finally, you will need to provide customer support to your users during Chinese working hours. So this can be done in-house by your own staff or outsourced to a company like App in China. So finally, we come to sales channels. So if you have a B2C software, then there's a wide range of user acquisition channels that you can test. And obviously, well, usually our recommendation is to spend a fairly small budget on each of these channels and test which ones provide the best return, and of course provide a positive return on investment. Generally for B2C, the options include app stores, search engine marketing, and social media platforms. So for app stores, if it's an iOS app, then you have obviously the Apple App Store China. The Apple App Store China, they have Apple search ads. These were launched in China in July last year and generally perform very, very well. The challenge is that if you want to run Apple search ads in China, you have to provide proof that your company has all of the legally required licenses, certificates, and filings that we covered earlier. So this means that to run Apple search ads, compliance is really essential. For the Android stores, you can run ads on each of the stores on which your app is published. And these have varying returns, and we can recommend on which ones you should focus on. For search engine marketing, by far the leading search engine in China is Baidu. So you can run Baidu ads. And then for social media platforms, again, there's a wide range. You can run ads on Tencent's network, which is primarily WeChat. You can run ads on ByteDance's network, which is primarily Douyin, Chinese TikTok. And there's a long list of additional platforms you can also try. For e-commerce platforms, it's also possible to sell software, especially B2C software, on the leading platforms in China, which is Tmall and JD. Tmall is the leading platform, about 58% market share, and then JD is second, approximately 17%. You can create these stores with your international entity, so the compliance requirements are lower, and you can then begin selling your software through these platforms. If you have B2B software, then generally the best channel is enterprise sales or direct sales to these companies. Again, this can be done in-house with your own team, who may be based in the EU or perhaps hired by your subsidiary here in China, or you can outsource to a company that provides this kind of sales or BD service, which includes our company, App in China. Generally, by far the easiest group of clients to reach and to sell to are, of course, your current clients. So your current users in the EU or elsewhere in the world. And you can speak with them, explain that you are planning or you have now published your software in China, and confirm whether they would like to use this for their entity or for their staff employed here in China. And then finally, for B2B software, we also recommend working with resellers and distributors. So many of the cloud service providers that I mentioned earlier, if you are using their service, they will help you with this. They can provide reselling service within their company to help you sell your software to their clients in the Chinese market. And then finally, you can also work with software distributors. Some examples I've listed here, VSTES, Ingram Micro, and Unis Digital. And these companies have offices, staff, and sales channels across China who can help to sell directly to the companies that they are in contact with. So that's everything. I hope that's useful to you, and I welcome any questions that you have. I'd be happy to give you some detailed advice on what would be the best strategy or solution for your company in the Chinese market.
Thank you, Rich. So yeah, if there is any question from the audience, please write them in the Q&A box. We are allocating a lot of time for the Q&A today because we would like to have questions coming from you directly rather than from us. And while we give the participants some time to think about the questions, maybe I do have some which we have received in the previous weeks. So I might just go ahead. The first one, actually, I have one on the compliance. I also seen that some of the participants joined only after we started. In the first part, there was a few slides on the compliance. So, Rich, you mentioned that at the beginning. You mentioned that whether or not one of the licenses, one certain license is required for the entity, it depends on the type of the software that you intend to operate. Can you make some example? I mean, what could be the differences? What kind of software might need some licenses? What others might not need licenses? And maybe since we're here, how long would it take to obtain such license, and how much would it cost?
Yeah, sure. So
maybe sorry again. If you can also go back to that slide so that people who join afterwards can also see it. Yes, thank you.
Sure. Okay, great. Yeah, so very happy to kind of clarify that. As I said, there are licenses which must be held by the entity which publishes the software, and there are certificates and filings you have to apply for each software that is being published. Functionality, I mean, the key ones to look at in terms of licenses are the VATS licenses, which is value-added telecommunication service licenses. And again, the most common of those are, well, B21, B22, B23, B24, and B25. B21, as listed here, is electronic data interchange. So that's basically if you're providing a platform which connects two sides, kind of buyers and sellers, you would need to have that license. So examples of that are e-commerce platforms. So if you're a platform that is connecting different companies and brands to sell to consumers, you must have that B21 EDI license. If you are only publishing your own e-commerce platform in China, meaning just for your brand, so for example, Adidas, and you're only selling Adidas products, you don't need that license. Other examples beyond e-commerce are ride-sharing apps, for example, which are connecting users and drivers who are self-employed, they're not employed by the platform that provides the service. It's these types of kind of platforms connecting buyers and sellers, basically. You also have B22, which is if your software includes any multi-party communication, so typically video communication. So Zoom would be an obvious example. then you have to hold this B22 license. B23 is for kind of chat services, not commonly required, but occasionally needed. B24 is for call center services. So again, not frequently needed, but if you're operating some kind of customer support service or call service, something like Zendesk or this type of thing, you have to obtain this license. And then B25 is kind of a long list of requirements written in law defining exactly when you need to obtain this license. It's generally if you are publishing content for the purpose of generating revenue in China, which applies to a lot of companies. But generally, it also requires a kind of interactive and social aspect and making it publicly available to Chinese users. But the B25 has kind of a long definition of when it's required, but that's by far the most commonly needed license. B22, 23, 24, those can in theory be obtained by a 100% foreign invested company. 21 and 25, with a couple of exceptions, you have to have a majority Chinese owned company to hold those licenses.
Right. And how long would it take to obtain such licenses? Like, so this is to give an idea to companies that are looking to enter China, just to give them a very rough time window after which they will be able to actually operate.
Yeah, so these kind of entity licenses can take quite a long time. So
yeah,
up to
I was
months,
suspecting that.
Yeah, and in many cases, you have to demonstrate that you have a track record of providing the service, which may be easy for a larger company, but for a smaller company, may be difficult. But yeah, unfortunately, it's pretty difficult to obtain these licenses. If a company needs a particular license, which in theory they can get themselves, generally the best step is to work with a partner to begin with, to launch and get started in the Chinese market. And then if you're able to obtain that license yourselves, then you can eventually transition over and publish it yourself in the Chinese market. But yeah, unfortunately, it's almost all of these VATS licenses are difficult and fairly expensive to obtain. So.
Right. Okay. Very good. Right. Then maybe I would move to another question. You mentioned you have worked with a lot of companies and software developers. So according to your experience, what you see are, let's say, the most successful or the most well received software in the Chinese market, international software in the Chinese market?
Yeah, sure. So firstly, in terms of apps, whether it's on Apple App Store or Android, I think I'm right in saying that the category where international apps are most successful is education. So if you look at the rankings, there's a lot of Chinese companies in every category, but education has the most, I think, from international developers. And that's typically language learning apps. So apps like Duolingo or Busuu or Drops. They obviously have expertise on the best way to learn foreign languages. And so they seem to do very well in the Chinese market. Another category, which is much bigger than that, is SaaS, so software as a service. SaaS has been kind of, in the past, like fairly underdeveloped in China. So generally companies have preferred to have the software installed on their own servers and not store any sensitive data in the cloud on SaaS platforms. That is steadily, I would say, rapidly changing. And so now more and more companies are adopting SaaS solutions. And so that includes things like enterprise resource planning or customer relationship management, accounting software, pretty much every category of SaaS is growing very rapidly. So that's also a very promising area if your company has, provides SaaS solutions to companies outside of China. Most of those companies, at least if they're big, will have operations in China. And even if they haven't asked your company about this yet, it's likely that they will be interested in using your SaaS platform in China as well, if you can make it available.
All right, thank you for this. Again, if there are questions from the audience, please write them now. There is one about, because we've been talking about apps, but actually also in our experience, we have seen some examples of companies that have software which is not an app, but it can be downloaded from a website. So now we have seen there were laws in China, like a situation that the overall internet environment in China is very regulated. How would it work if I have my software that could be downloaded from my website hosted outside China? Can this website be accessed within China from Chinese users, or would I need to do other things? How would it work? And I'm referring to a specific example. We had this company that have their one software which is used for academic research, and it's sold to Chinese, it's directed to Chinese universities or research institutes, but they have it, you can just download it from their website hosted in Europe.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. So, if you have a website, you have software downloadable and hosted outside of China, it can be reached by Chinese users, unless, of course, it becomes blocked in China. So it's definitely not a kind of stable long-term solution, but it can work, at least in the short term. It's also important to point out that it's not compliant at all with Chinese law. It's just simply available to Chinese users, but it has no kind of permission to be published and sold in the Chinese market. So this means that generally, if you want to ensure legal compliance, then you kind of have to, essentially block Chinese users from accessing and downloading your software. And yeah, generally there's going to be also performance issues as well when they try to use it here in the Chinese market. The way to solve that, generally those types of platforms, you will need a B25 commercial ICP license. So you need to work with a Chinese partner. That partner will then publish your website in the Chinese market and help you to sell your software to Chinese clients. So.
Okay, thank you. So speaking of partners, you mentioned that if you work with some of these platforms, then maybe they might be able to introduce you to some resellers, to some distributors. What if you don't work with these platforms? How can you identify such partners? And another thing, what would be your advice in working with them? For instance, if you reach an agreement with them, what would be the things that you really need to pay attention to, you really need to be extremely careful in?
Sure. So I would say if you don't want to work with kind of distributors and resellers, or perhaps your software is too small and they don't want to work with you, as I mentioned, probably the best way is just direct sales. So having your own sales team contact potential clients. Obviously, that generally has to be in Chinese. So many companies will have Chinese-speaking staff, whether in China or in Europe. And if not, then you can employ somebody or work with a kind of outsourced provider like App in China. In terms of being careful working with these companies, I guess one key thing to focus on is to ensure that your software will be a priority for them. We've heard many stories of companies signing with a partner, and they are just one of hundreds of partners that they have. and they don't, you know, they don't really put much resources and effort into helping you to sell that software to Chinese companies. So definitely ensuring that your software is going to be a priority. And of course, you can put terms into your contract to ensure that that is the case. Beyond that, obviously, you need to do some due diligence, and obviously you can work with local law firms to do that. You can sort of check on platforms like Chi-Cha-Cha, for example. You can check the background of companies, look at any previous legal issues, court cases, tax problems, etc., and just make sure the company you're dealing with is trustworthy. Of course, you can back that up by speaking with other companies, law firms, consulting companies, etc., who can recommend trustworthy partners to work with.
Okay, thank you. And by the way, actually, at the USME Center, we are very active in this due diligence kind of area. We have a lot of resources. We've done webinars in the past about some practical tips on how to do some background checks. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to us anytime. We will be happy to help you have this background check. This is very, very important. We have one question. Can you share some client examples from different categories?
Yeah, sure. So we have a list of clients that are kind of, we can publicly talk about on our website. I'll kind of maybe just keep them anonymous, I think, to not have anything kind of confidential. But one kind of common category of clients that we have are clinical trial data platforms. So these are platforms that are used by pharmaceutical companies who are testing medicines and drugs in the Chinese market. They will use these platforms to gather the trial data from patients to make sure that these medicines are performing well. And then obviously this is then used to obtain permission to sell these medicines in the Chinese market. So in those cases, that's a very, very, as you can imagine, a very restricted industry. And it's not possible for those companies to publish and operate those platforms themselves in China. So they have to work with a local publisher like us. Our company is then responsible. We have all the licenses that are required as a domestic company, and we're then responsible for publishing and running that platform in the Chinese market. So that's typically a website which patients can log into, and also a dashboard, a website where doctors and hospital staff can log in as well. And then in many cases also apps, Android and iOS apps for patients and doctors to use as well. All that data then has to be stored in China. There's a lot of what's defined as sensitive personal information. So that all has to be hosted in China, again, fully held by our company. And then we have to apply for permission for that data to be exported out of China to be viewed by our clients or by the pharmaceutical companies. So yeah, that's kind of a typical case. Another common,
maybe sorry, Rich, before moving forward on this, actually, this is extremely interesting because we had one company that also used to operate a similar software, not for clinical trials, but still for R&D on chemistry stuff. So you mentioned that the need to work with a local partner, I guess, is because of hosting data in China to ensure that the personal information are protected and things like those. But you mentioned that you then need to apply, the local partner needs to apply for permission to move basically this data across borders. How does this process work? Is it hard? Could there be any issues arising from it, or I don't know, what's the overall process like?
Yeah, so firstly, it's difficult to be very precise on that because this is mostly based on the personal information protection law, and a lot of the details of that law are still to be confirmed. So for many categories of data and many industries, the exact procedure on how to apply for that permission has still not been formally confirmed, which is kind of an awkward situation to be in. But all companies are kind of, in many cases, waiting for those rules to be further clarified. But yeah, generally you have to declare to the relevant government bureau. So in this case, the kind of health department, you have to declare all the different categories of data that you're collecting, the volume of that data. So is it hundreds of people or hundreds of thousands of people? And then you get permission from that bureau confirming that this data can be exported out of China. Or they may say this data cannot be exported out of China, and then you have to kind of anonymize it and kind of limit the data before it can then be exported. But yeah, the general answer is that the exact regulations for doing this across every industry are still to be confirmed. So,
all right. Okay, thank you for the explanation. So other client examples where you are about to introduce?
Yeah, sure. So another very common example, as I mentioned earlier, is education, so kind of language learning apps. And these are obviously, well, occasionally B2B, but in most cases they are purely B2C. So that's a very different situation from this kind of clinical trial data platform that I mentioned earlier. And in these cases, typically you need to publish the apps on the Apple App Store. So the Apple App Store, firstly, very similar to the Apple App Store globally. And at the moment, international companies can simply publish in China using the international Apple developer console. So you can just select mainland China and then publish in the Chinese market. Occasionally, Apple requires you to provide these licenses, certificates, and filings, and proof that you have these, but in most cases they don't. That's likely to change at some point this year. Apple is kind of being pressured to follow all these laws and regulations, as you would expect, in the same way that the Chinese Android stores do. So it's likely that in the next few months, Apple will be required to, companies will need to provide proof of all of these licenses before they can publish in the Chinese market. And again, in many cases, this will require a partnership with a local publisher. And then for Android, as I mentioned earlier, you need to publish on the leading Chinese Android stores. Typically the top 5 or the top 10 are sufficient, but there are kind of 20, 30 stores in total. And yeah, the challenge there is if you have a very well-known, high-quality app, Duolingo, for example, is kind of the global leader in language learning, then generally Chinese consumers will search for your app anyway, and it will rise to the top and be popular. If your app is struggling internationally, like it's not got a very large user base, generally it's not a good idea to publish that B2C app in China. Some companies kind of imagine that China will get their app and they'll have massive success in China. But if you haven't had success in the EU or US or the rest of the world, it's extremely unlikely that your app is going to suddenly have magical success in the Chinese market. So yeah, if you have a very kind of high quality and successful app, it's likely to do well organically. If your app is good quality, but not the most famous and well known, then it's more of a challenge. And in those cases, you're generally going to need to spend on user acquisition, running advertising. Typically on the app stores is the most effective to promote your app and help Chinese users to find it. And then obviously whether they continue using it and spend money and share it and things depends on the quality. That obviously is the key thing. including the quality of the localization work that you have done. But yeah, if it's not super famous and well known, you generally have to spend a bit on advertising to kind of to boost it and help it to achieve success. And then in terms of monetization of those apps, so if your revenue model is based on advertising, as I mentioned, you need to swap out any international advertising SDK and replace it with the Chinese equivalent. We can kind of recommend some that perform really, really well. That also ensures compliance, because the ads that run within your app, if you're displaying ads which are not legally compliant in China, there's a risk that your app can be taken down from the Apple App Store or the Android app stores. And yeah, then if your app is if your revenue model, is based on in-app payments, then as I mentioned, you need to integrate with Alipay and WeChat Pay. And you typically, nowadays many apps are based on subscription payments. So instead of a one-time payment, it's usually free, like freemium model, it's free to start with. And then if you want to use the full functionality, you need to pay a monthly or annual fee. This is possible to do with Alipay. It's difficult with Alipay and WeChat Pay. Our company is able to provide that by default with Alipay. So you can get users to sign up for a monthly or annual subscription. WeChat Pay is much more difficult. So for WeChat Pay, it's on a case-by-case basis for every single app or software, and you have to demonstrate a very high volume of sales and a very kind of reliable reputation for that particular app before WeChat Pay will give you the permission to collect recurring or subscription payments. But that's kind of a very important factor for many companies to kind of maximize their revenue in the Chinese market.
All right. Very good. Maybe out of curiosity, you just mentioned that education apps are very popular. What do you think is the outlook for this? Because last year I think there were a lot of new regulations kind of restricting the education sector, but also the gaming sector. I'm thinking about gaming apps. What do you think is the outlook for this? I'm not sure if the online education apps were also included in these kind of new regulations or not, but what do you think is the outlook for this?
Yeah, sure. That's a very kind of topical question. So yeah, you had this dual alleviation policy last year, kind of massively restricting, kind of clamping down on, mainly focused on after school tuition. So as you know, lots of kind of after school English and language learning companies collapsed. Because basically the key focus of that policy is to kind of minimize the need for parents to send their kids to after school tuition, to have after school activities and study requirements. And it's also focused on the core subjects. So things, I forget the exact list, but it's like English learning, maths, science, obviously Chinese learning. So if you are targeting students in the kind of core subjects, typically I think it's students under 18, high school students or younger, then it may be challenging and may not be a good opportunity for your company. If you're targeting education for students in those non-core subjects, so for example, learning how to do coding, for example, or something else like that, then it's still fine, and you can provide that your software in China. If your software is not focused on minors under the age of 18, then you can freely publish. So language learning apps primarily now focused on adults, people over the age of 18 in China. And then as a separate topic for games, you mentioned, I didn't cover that in this talk, but games is now a very, very difficult market to enter for international companies. The main issue here is that you are required to obtain ISBN, which is like a game approval number, basically. This has always been difficult to get, but now it is almost impossible for international companies to obtain. So I forget the numbers, but I think last year or 2 years ago, about 80 companies, 80 games rather, obtained this license. And then I think it's still the case there have been no new approvals for international games over the past few months or even a year. So it's basically stopped and essentially impossible to publish a game in China. The only real workaround there is if your game is, not quite a game, it's more an educational tool or something else. If you can define it not as a pure game, but as something separate, then it can, of course, be published in that category. But if it's a pure game that needs to be published in the gaming category, then it's really challenging and not something that you can easily get around, basically. So,
okay. Now, thanks for the explanation. I think, indeed, for games is going to be very, very tough. One very last question before we end this. So we know that, and we receive many questions on WeChat mini programs. Mini programs can be a very effective way actually to sell online, even for small producers. And we mostly receive cases from food and beverage companies, retail companies that they have their own WeChat mini program to sell things. But what about software? What is the opportunity that maybe you have a software? Can you somehow integrate it in WeChat as a mini program or things like those?
Yeah, sure. I mean, generally, obviously depends on the cases. If you are selling a software in China, it's not really something that you would choose to sell through a WeChat mini program. There may be exceptions to that, but generally it's not really a kind of convenient way, or it's not really a way that people would search and discover your software. So yeah, I wouldn't recommend kind of using a WeChat store or a WeChat mini program for that purpose. There may be some cases where so generally, if you need to develop an app or a software from scratch, specifically for the Chinese market, that can be pretty expensive and time consuming. Developing a mini program is in many cases much cheaper and faster. So if you need something to be available just for China, you may choose to develop a mini program rather than developing an app. And again, if you are publishing a mini program in China, WeChat requires that you hold all the necessary licenses, certificates, and filings, same as any other software. So you'll also need to do that same compliance report to make sure that you're able to publish that mini program in the Chinese market.
Okay, very, very clear. Thank you, Rich, for answering all these questions and for the great presentation. Again, if there is any question from the audience in the future, you can reach out to us, of course, but also to Rich and their company. They have a lot of experience in this area, so I'm very sure they will be happy to help. Maybe sorry, Rich, if you can stop sharing your screen so I can put my last slide, my last thank you slide. Okay, so no, yeah, again, I think it's about time to end. If there are any questions, you can reach out to of course to Rich, but also to us. We have, as I mentioned at the beginning, free services. Our objective, our mission is to help European SMEs, and we have experts, external, internal, to do so. If we cannot help you, we will for sure redirect you to other experts, like in this case, Rich would be one of them. So do not hesitate to contact us. We are here for you. And yeah, I guess we can end it here. Thank you, Rich, for being here, and yeah, have a good evening.
Thank you.